members, and welcome to the members of Temple Bethel. We're delighted that we could join together this evening. I'm Nancy Singer. I'm known as the Aunt. And I am the president of our Women of Sinai. We've been putting on these Zoom events, well, for quite a few months now, a couple of times a month, sponsored by our Women of Sinai, our brotherhood, and our parent teachers organization. And it is my honor tonight to welcome my beloved niece, Rabbi Suzanne Singer, to be our speaker. I said to Suzanne, you don't need to send me a bio. I think I know it pretty well. She was born in New York City, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and the first grandchild of Rose M. Singer, for whom the women's jail on Rikers Island in New York is named. It's called the family jail by all of us. And she's followed her grandmother's devotion to social action and tikkun olam. She went to UC Berkeley, as I did. She studied journalism, worked for PBS. The POV series was her baby. There are 2 Emmys in her living room. And after 20 years, she decided to take a class at the University of Judaism and was hooked. She was ordained in 2003. And her first pulpit as an ordained rabbi was at Temple Sinai in Oakland, the temple from which our beloved Jack Olshansky had recently left as the president of that temple. Later, 3 years later, she came back to LA, pursued social action, did a lot of teaching. And in 2008, Temple Bethel in Riverside convinced her to come be their rabbi. And my husband and I loved having her much closer to us. Actually, Suzanne had planned to have her B'nai Mitzvah there, but COVID got in the way. But she has continued her social action, traveling to underprivileged countries during her sabbaticals. And last month, she was installed as president of the Pacific Area of Reform Rabbis. So now I'd like to turn it over to Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's lovely to be here this evening with everybody. And so we're going to talk about the women of Purim. And I'm going to share my screen with you. Someone came up with the idea that this was a war between them. I'm not sure that that's the case, but we're going to look at, which one of these is a feminist? Neither, both, or one of them. So what I want to do is I want to start off by reading a little bit from the actual story. I assume most of us are familiar with it, but I just wanted to highlight a few things in terms of the story. So it begins within the 3rd year of his reign. This is King Ahasuerus. He made a feast for all his princes and his servants for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And royal wine was in abundance. Now this guy likes to drink, likes to feast. And that is a real measure of who these guys are in the story. So now Vashti was his wife, and she decided to make a feast of her own with the women. And it was also on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded that 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown on, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. So the rabbis of our tradition interpret this to mean that she was supposed to appear naked with just the crown on. It doesn't say that here, but since it mentions the crown, they figure that's all she's actually wearing. And he's drunk and he wants to show her off to his pals. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. And of course, this made the king very, very angry. He said to the wise men, and the question is, how wise were they? What shall we do to Queen Vashti? Memucan answered, Vashti the queen has done wrong, not only to the king, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's deed shall be known to all women, so they shall be emboldened to treat their husbands with disrespect. They will say that King Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought before him, but she would not come. And that will, of course, set a really terrible example for other men and other women. So he says, let a royal decree be issued by you And let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, never to be revoked, that Vashti shall never again appear before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate to another who is more worthy than she. And when the king's decree shall be published throughout all his empire, all the wise, both great and small, shall give honor to their husbands. Now, my Bible professor, Dr. Tamara Eskenazi, pointed out that by issuing this decree, he's actually now publicizing the fact that Vashti would not appear and publicizing the fact that, hey, you know what? Maybe a woman can actually not listen to her husband. So in a sense, this decree is completely counterproductive and shows you the level of thinking that goes on in the head of this King Ahasuerus and his pals. So now the Midrash, which expands on the story in the Bible, it has a number of different interesting perspectives on Vashti. They portray her feast as a banquet for women, which was different from the men's. She gave them different types of drinks that women like. I mean, maybe they got, something fancy with cream and cherries in it, not just straight old wine, and served them different manner of sweets that are favored by women. This banquet was held in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. So one of the Midrash stories says that the festivities were conducted in decorated and adorned rooms that suited women's tastes, while another tradition says that she hosted the women in spacious rooms so that if they wished to use them for licentious behavior, one would not be ashamed in front of her fellow. So of course, this is already skewed against Vashti and her friends, because clearly they're doing this in order to get into some kind of sexual trouble. Now, the Babylonian rabbis really don't like Vashti. As you probably know, we have writings from Babylonia where the Jews were exiled. We also have writings from Israel itself. So the Babylonian rabbis really think of Vashti as just the worst, a wicked Jew hater, and of course, wanton. So they complain about the fact that she's holding her banquet in the royal palace, which was meant for men, certainly not for women. And it should have been held in the natural venue for such an event, which is the harem, because obviously in those days, King Ahasuerus had a whole batch of women who were wives and mistresses. And of course, from this, they learned that Vashti was planning on something licentious when she organized her banquet. So in other words, she's just as bad as Ahasuerus. Of course, Ahasuerus and Vashti are non-Jewish, royalty. And so therefore they represent pagans who are, not good people. And they oppress the people that live under them. So they also figure out, okay, she's an adulteress, right? So why is it that she refuses to show up for her husband's friends? I mean, after all, if she's a wanton, licentious woman, why wouldn't she want to show off her beautiful body? Well, they come up with this interesting idea that her plans were upset when leprosy erupted over her entire body, so that she could not make an appearance before the guests. So here she is refusing because, she's so modest and beautiful. She does not want to have her horrible disease showing in front of everybody else. Actually, there's another Midrash that says that actually a tail was placed on her by one of the angels. And so she sort of became a half man, half woman. I don't know, they just, whatever, whatever they can come up with, they throw on her. And they want to show that whatever happens to her, she deserved it. So in other words, it doesn't say anything in the story about Vashti being decapitated or killed or anything like that, but that's what the rabbis come up with, that she got decapitated. The story just says that he banishes her, that's all. But so why would they decapitate her? Why would the royal folks decide to decapitate her? And why does she deserve this punishment? So they come up with this idea that she insisted that they not rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. That the king apparently wanted to, but no, absolutely not. Did not want that to be rebuilt, because of course the rabbis are in Babylonia after the temple was destroyed, and they say a clue to her misbehavior was the fact that the king summoned her on the 7th day. So the king was merry with wine. He had had a week's worth of drinking and feasting. But for them, the 7th day refers, of course, to Shabbat. It wasn't the 7th day of the feast, actually, according to the rabbis. It was the 7th day of the week. And Vashti was ordered to appear naked before the king on a Sabbath. And that was a fitting punishment for enslaving Jewish maidens and forcing them to work on their day of rest. So because she's coming on the Sabbath, and because whatever punishment she gets is measure for measure, what she deserves, they just deduce from this that what Vashti used to do was make poor Jewish women work on the Sabbath. And actually, I did read some articles, which I didn't copy here, but they thought of her as the Harvey Weinstein of those days, because she forced these poor women to work and, you know, was a licentious woman, and God knows what else she did to the poor Jewish women. Now, the rabbis from Eretz Yisrael, from Israel, are a little more positive. So they say that Vashti sent emissaries back to the king 3 times in an attempt to persuade him to withdraw his demand. So in other words, she's going to try to use her powers of persuasion to tell the king this is really not a good idea. She says, you know, she tries to speak to his heart, knowing what kind of a person she is. And she says, you know, if they see me and think that I'm beautiful, they're going to want to lie with me. They're going to want to have sex with me, and then they'll kill you, right? That was the reason that Abraham supposedly said that Sarah was his sister when they went to Pharaoh's court, because, hey, she was so beautiful, the Pharaoh would want her for himself and therefore kill her husband. And that's why Abraham said, please say that you're my sister. So here's same argument. They're going to think I'm beautiful and they're going to want me and they're going to kill you. On the other hand, if they think that I'm ugly, that's going to look bad on you because it's going to reflect on you. So she goes through all sorts of things. I didn't include all of it here, but she tries really hard to persuade him that he has to think about the consequences of his actions, and that he wields a scepter only because of his marriage to her, and it's not appropriate to order her to do something against her will. So what they're trying to show is that, in contrast with Vashti here, Ahasuerus is a ruler who acts rashly and does not think even one single step ahead. Now, something that, you know, we should also look at in the story is how the men are portrayed, because really and truly they're not portrayed in a very positive light, none of them. And if we have time during our question and answer later, we can talk about Mordecai. I did not include him in here because I'm focusing on the women, but there's some things we can say about Mordecai and his behavior, in addition to Haman's and Ahasuerus's. So the Midrash draws the following distinction. Vashti may be evil, but unlike her husband, she's no knave. Possessing wisdom and street smarts, she understands how to manipulate the king. Well, she understands it, but she doesn't succeed. But ultimately, she must die for her sins. Yet even if she's driven by sheer self-interest, Vashti's intelligence serves as a foil to the foolishness of her husband. And we'll see that time after time, Ahasuerus is shown up by the women in the story. Vashti may be morally bankrupt, but that in no way detracts from her superior intellect, which the rabbis go out of their way to underscore. And they do that because they want to show Ahasuerus as being in a negative light. So we're going to go back to the story now. This is the next chapter, a piece of it. Now the king was lonely. So, you know, the king banishes Vashti. He doesn't think ahead about what that's going to mean in terms of his being lonely. And, you know, he sort of regrets almost right away that he banished her, divorced her. So he sends his people out to find the most beautiful virgins of the land. And they bring all these girls from all over the place, from the capital and to the care of Haggai, who's a eunuch. And Esther, you know, I didn't include everything here, but Esther, as you probably know, is either Mordecai's cousin or niece. We're not sure. Mordecai says to her, you should go and try out for this role. Don't tell him that you're Jewish. Now, there's no reason that he gives for not saying that she's Jewish, and there's no reason to think actually that there's any sort of anti-Semitism going on at this point in the story. There really is no indication of that at all. So that's an odd little thing in there that we might want to unpack. So Esther's taken to the palace, and Haggai supplies her with cosmetics. And the full period of her preparation before a girl went to the king was 12 months. 6 months of treatment with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. And then when it was Esther's turn, the girl whom Mordecai had adopted, the king loved her more than any other woman and placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, we go on to another part of the story. There's some twists and turns in this story. After this all happens, King Ahasuerus promotes Haman to be the prime minister. Boo, yeah. And now he insists that people bow down to him, and Mordecai refuses to. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about why he wouldn't bow down to Haman. And one of the reasons that's been given is, well, Jews don't bow down to anybody except to God. Well, it's not entirely clear that that's the case. We don't really know why he won't bow down. Again, a discussion for later about Mordecai's role in the story. But he wouldn't show reverence to Haman. And Haman got pissed. By the way, exactly like Ahasuerus. Their response is to get angry, right? So Haman's angry. And lo and behold, because one Jewish guy, he finds out that he's Jewish, one Jewish guy won't bow down to him, all of a sudden he wants to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom. And this is a very interesting, and we're not going to focus on that tonight, but that could be a whole other discussion about how anti-Semitism develops and how, a stereotype is built from one encounter, and all of a sudden all Jews are now bad people that need to be eliminated. So Haman goes to the king and says, look, there's a certain people scattered throughout all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from every other people. Neither do they keep the king's laws, and it does not befit the king to tolerate them. So Haman is coming sort of like Iago, whispering in the ear of Othello or, any other people who serve someone in power, and start giving him some ideas about why the Jews might not be welcome. So what does the king do? Here we go. Let's have another decree. And so Haman says, why don't you draw up an order that all these Jews may be destroyed? And I'm going to put 10,000 talents of silver in the royal treasury. Now, that is probably some kind of, blackmail or bribery. So it's not enough to explain that this is not good for you. It's going to also be beneficial to you financially. So obviously this is something you're going to be interested in doing. And the king doesn't even ask a question, doesn't say, well, are you sure this is the case? And I have never had a problem with Jews. Fine, here's my ring, send out the writ. And it goes out to the couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to exterminate all the Jews. Young and old, children and women. And one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar, and their goods were to be treated as spoil. So they get to keep all the goods. Now, when Mordecai hears this, he's really upset. Of course, he's Jewish. He doesn't want to have his people destroyed. He rents his clothing, which is basically a sign of mourning, puts on sackcloth with ashes. And he goes into the midst of the city and cries and cries. And Esther sends her maids to him to find out what's going on. Why is my cousin or my uncle crying? And they tell her, and she sends new clothing to Mordecai so that he can, not sit there embarrassing her. Like, this is my uncle out there making a scene of himself. He refuses, and he tells Esther's servant that she needs to go to the king and beseech the king and implore him to save her people. And she says, look, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come before the king into the inner court, who is not called, he or she will be put to death, except for the one whom the king hands the golden scepter. He may live. So in other words, the king has to call me. I can't just initiate that on my own. But I've not been called to the king in 30 days. So Mordecai responds to Esther, do not think that because you are in the royal palace, you alone of all the Jews shall escape. Okay, this is the story from way back. There were always court Jews who served the powers that be by collecting taxes or lending money or whatever it was. And, you know, if you think that because you're a court Jew, you're going to be saved when the tide turns, forget it. And he, you know, says, look, you're going to be just as, you know, liable to be killed as a Jew as anybody else. And if you remain silent at such a time as this, then deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's house shall be destroyed, and who knows whether it is not for a time like this that you have become queen. In other words, you know, maybe God put you here because God is not in this story, but maybe somehow God's hand was behind this to make you queen and get us out of this horrible predicament. So she goes ahead, puts on her royal apparel. She stands in the inner court facing the palace, and the king is on his royal throne. Now, this takes a certain amount of guts at this point, right? Because he could just say off with her head too. But when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained his favor, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king says to her, what is it, Queen Esther? Whatever you request, up to half my kingdom, it shall be granted you. See, once again, this guy is so impulsive that he doesn't know why she's there. Maybe she just wants to sleep with him that night. Who knows? But he's willing to give her half his kingdom for whatever it is that she's requested. I mean, you know, no thought behind anything he says or does. And she says, you know what I want to do is I want to have a party. Because what else does this king like more but a party, a banquet? And she says, is that what you want? And basically they go through two banquets, but he says, fine, we'll have a banquet. And then she says, if I found favor with your majesty, what I ask is that my own life and the lives of my people be spared, for we have been sold. So now what happens is, and I skipped this whole thing because I didn't want to read the whole scroll of Esther, but so Haman's been invited to this party, and Haman's like rubbing his hands. Oh, wow, I got invited to this party with the king and queen. I'm the only guest. He brags to his wife about it. And, you know, and so then she's got him there. They both get a little drunk. They're all very comfortable. And now she feels that she can expose him for who he is. So she tells the king, we've been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, slain, and exterminated. King Ahasuerus demands, who is he and where is he? Who has dared to do such a thing? A ruthless enemy, she answered, this wicked Haman. Whoa. So one of the eunuchs, Harbona, says, I know what we can do with him. There is a gallows 75 feet high standing at Haman's house, and it was erected for Mordecai, whose evidence once saved her majesty. Let Haman be hanged on it, said the king. So this is a book of reversals. Okay, so Haman thought that he was such a hotshot that one day the king says to him, what do you think I should do for a man who's just been amazing in my life and is so important to me? Haman, thinking it's him, he says, you parade him around on a white horse and declare to everybody, this is an amazing person. And the king says, yes, I'd like you to do that, please, for Mordecai. Because Mordecai had heard some people plotting against the king. He reported it, and the king then wanted to thank him. And this is how he thanked him, with Haman parading him around on a horse. The gallows is set up so that Haman can hang Mordecai, and Haman gets hung on that gallows. We have a pagan queen who's replaced by a Jewish queen. And also what's going to happen at the end of this is that Mordecai is going to take Haman's place. So everything is topsy-turvy and upside down. Okay, before I go into some other commentary, I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment to see if anybody has any questions or comments. So please feel free to unmute or raise your hand or whatever. If you have none, we can go on, but I'm happy to answer questions or take a comment or two. Okay, I have some real questions at the end that I'm going to ask you, but in the meantime, we'll go back to the commentary. Okay, so the rabbis generally think that Esther is just the ideal woman, modest, beautiful, obedient, of course, obedience, that's, faithful to her God, and courageous, right? I mean, she goes into this situation where she could have been killed, and she goes and does her thing. As I said before, Vashti is a pagan queen, and she's seen as the incarnation of evil and faithlessness. And we saw some details about how they understand that. But now I want to look at some feminist commentary. So the first feminist, Catherine Pfister Dar, says, not long ago, a Jewish friend bemoaned her daughter's delight in dressing up as Esther for the children's annual Purim celebration. I tell her, don't be Esther, be Vashti. I want her to be strong and independent, not passive and compliant. So there are a number of feminists who do not particularly like Esther because they find her to be compliant and passive. And here's one statement: Esther, for the chance of winning wealth and power, takes her place in the herd of maidens who become concubines of the king. She wins her victories not by skill or by character, but by her beauty. She conceals her origin, is relentless toward a fallen enemy, secures not merely that the Jews escape from danger, but that they fall upon their enemies, slay their wives and children, and plunder their property. So this is something that I did not include, but we rarely include it in our story, our retelling of the story of Purim. But yes, the Jews escape being killed. But what happens is that the decree that was sent out by King Ahasuerus via Haman to kill the Jews, once a decree goes out, it cannot be called back in. Sort of like pushing toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. You can't put it back in. So the decree went out, everyone's prepared to kill the Jews, but what they can do is issue a second decree. And the second decree basically says that the Jews can fight back. And the Jews do fight back, and they do kill thousands of people in the kingdom who are not Jewish. And that's the part that we usually skip right over, because Purim is supposed to be a very happy holiday. It's supposed to be the holiday that remains even after Messiah comes and we're in the world to come. So why are we going to talk about Jews killing people? But the fact is, that's what happens at the end of the story. This is Rabbi Sari Laufer, who says, in our attempt to pretty up Purim and make it palatable for our littlest learners, we set the story in an innocent beauty pageant, right? They all come parading in front of the king, and he has to pick which of these virgins he thinks is the loveliest and smells the most and is the softest from all of the oil that they put on them. The stuff of pretty dresses and sparkly jewels. In reality, as I recently read, the voiceless virginal Esther is delivered, by whom we're not told, to the king's harem. There she spends a year, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and feminine cosmetics, under the tutelage of 7 court-appointed handmaidens, preparing for a sexual liaison with Ahasuerus. If she fails to win the king's favor and become the queen, she faces a lifetime sentence as a royal concubine. Yes, that's something that I don't think Mordecai took into account when he sent her off to go into this beauty pageant and try to be the next queen. Because if she didn't succeed in being the queen, she'd just be in the harem, and he would just have sex with her periodically, and that would be the end of her, her life as far as having any agency whatsoever. Then as now, women's bodies were seen as commodities, as something to barter and trade. We cannot ignore it then, as we cannot ignore it now. So this is the version of Esther as a sort of puppet, an object that has been manipulated and not somebody with agency. And again, Alice Laffey says that buried in Esther's character is full compliance with patriarchy. In contrast to Vashti, who refused to be men's sexual object and her husband's toy, Esther is the stereotypical woman in a man's world. She wins favor by the physical beauty of her appearance and then by her ability to satisfy sexually. She concentrates on pleasing those in power, and that is men. So no great shakes for her. But Marjorie Zoet Bankston says, Vashti's story meant to be a warning against saying such a no has just the opposite effect from what was intended. It gives me an invitation to say no when my body is about to be violated. I feel proud of Vashti's refusal. I love her reckless strength. So Vashti, if we want to, not pay attention to the rabbi's view of her as a terrible pagan queen, is someone who says, no, I'm not coming to parade in front of you for friends, and you're all drunk and who knows what you're going to do to me. That's not safe. And I'm having my own party. I don't want to be disturbed. Leave me alone. And even though, as I said earlier, they publicize this and say no woman is allowed to do that, they're telling everybody that someone just did that. And therefore, that is an option. And Alice Laffey clearly likes Vashti better than Esther. Vashti's banishment is not because of her disobedience, but because of the potential effects of her disobedience. If Vashti were not punished, her decision could be the start of a major revolution. Other women might look to her as their model. Her example would then empower them to rebel against the domination of their husbands. She was cast off because she was an enormous threat to the patriarchal status quo. Well, I'm sure there are people who did get inspired by her and probably did start a revolution. In fact, she's an example for the early feminists in the early 20th century. Now, Esther, according to Sidney Ann White, maybe isn't such a puppet without agency, because according to Sidney Ann White, her conduct throughout the story has been a masterpiece of feminine skill. From the beginning to the end, she does not make a misstep. She's a model for the successful conduct of life in the diaspora. By accepting the reality of a subordinate position and learning to gain power by working within the structure rather than against it, this is how she succeeds. Okay, this is how we do it here. I need to make sure that we save the Jews. How do I do it? Well, there's this king and he likes to drink, so I'm going to set up a feast for him. And Haman likes to be flattered too, so I'm going to invite him to the special feast. And once both of them are nice and drunk, I'm going to reveal what's going on. And obviously the king is inclined to do what she'd like. And therefore I will succeed in saving the Jews this way. In the end, Esther's obedience and passivity are her saving grace, as they enable her both access and entry that she otherwise would not have had. But it's not until she's able to subvert these qualities that she is able to truly save the day. It takes some growth until she learns to wield these qualities. So yes, it's very possible that when she first gets to the palace, she doesn't think of herself as somebody who has power and who's able to change things. But once she's confronted by her uncle Mordecai, hey, you know what? You got to do this. This is your role now. She's able to step up to the plate and use those qualities to make things happen in the right way. Esther begins the story as an incredible docile figure, obedient to both the edicts of the king and in her daily life and actions to Mordecai. It's not until she finds herself stuck between the demands of the two men that Esther ultimately breaks free and finds her strength. To do this, she must reconcile the fact that one does not go to the king unless called for, with Mordecai's directive to go before the king and plead for the Jews. The truth is, there is no one way to be a strong feminist figure. Just as Vashti's brashness can be held up as a model for today's women, so can Esther's consideration and tact. Now, again, we now have Leah Birkenwald, and we're now seeing that, maybe there are two different approaches to take if you want to think about who's really a feminist here. So Leah Birkenwald says, unlike the majority of biblical women, Esther and Vashti were autonomous and they made their own choices. Vashti refused to obey and pay the price. Esther chose to play the system to get the job done. Regardless of which method you prefer, both women played active roles in their own lives. Feminism is tricky to define, but choice and autonomy make up its ideological core. We must remember that there is no right way to be a feminist. As we re-examine these texts, it's important to recognize that more than one type of woman can be a feminist heroine. So here are the questions I'd like to discuss. So is it better to work from within or from without the system to implement change? How much danger should we risk when standing up for what we believe? Okay, so the third question is, in the end, which role model would we want our own daughters to follow? Okay, so let's have a little conversation about this. Let's start with, is it better to work within the system or outside the system in order to implement change? So that's like the difference between, radical change or incremental change, I think would be one way to characterize that. Yeah, Sandy.
I think it depends on the situation. Sometimes it's better, like for Vashti, it was better that she do the things the way she did them. But for Esther, it was better to work from within the system.
Okay.
I don't think there's only one right way to be.
Okay, so it depends on the circumstances.
Mhm.
I mean, I'll tell you something. Right now I'm on a police review task force for the city of Riverside about trying to make some suggestions for reform. And the question is, do we do incremental reform or do we do something much more radical? Not defund the police per se, but I was just on another committee meeting with the Commission on Social Action for the Reform Movement, and it was also about police. And the ACLU was making a presentation and talking about, I guess in Minneapolis, what they were trying to do, they haven't succeeded, but they were trying to just completely revamp the whole system. Like, let's just rethink how this money is allocated. How much money do we want for, the police, and how much for health, and how much for whatever, as opposed to let's do little changes like, okay, the cops have to wear body cameras and that way we'll know what's going on. So, it's really two different philosophies about how you make change. And I guess also how much change is going to stick, right? A revolutionary moment might not last. Nancy, what do you think? You were saying,
I'm agreeing with what you're saying completely. And I'm agreeing with Sandy, what she said. It totally depends on, well, I think it depends on the subject of the change, also the magnitude of the change, whether it's best to go from within or without.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, I'm not taking a position one way or the other, but I think we've seen that when there have been revolutions, very often the revolutionaries end up becoming just like the people they replaced. And having been a public television producer and programming executive, I'm thinking specifically, I was there in the 80s about a whole bunch of countries that went through revolutions. For example, Nicaragua or El Salvador. I mean, Daniel Ortega, who was the revolutionary in Nicaragua, has become a dictator. So maybe there's something about revolutionary change that doesn't allow it to last. I don't know, because meantime, we've tried a lot of, incremental changes in this country to deal with things like racism, and yet here we are still dealing with it. I don't know about the feminist revolution, how much that was incremental or radical. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well,
Do we follow Vashti or did we follow Esther in that?
I think it's definitely incremental.
Okay.
But you put it in an ancient perspective. What happened over the next 1,000 years after this particular story, but here, the story is definitely incremental. Starting, when, the 50s, the 40s.
Yeah.
So, it definitely wasn't revolutionary.
To the point where young people today take it for granted. All the things like, the right to abortion or whatever it is, they take it for granted. It's always been this way, right? And
certainly with my 27-year-old daughter.
There you go.
Whose mother was a good role model for her too.
Yeah, I think incremental change makes it seem like it's always been there. And yet it hasn't. So the second question is, how much risk do we take to make change? And I'll tell you, this really resonates for me from a trip I took last year. So I went with the American Jewish World Service to Guatemala, and we were talking about moral courage. Now, definitely Esther demonstrates moral courage here because she could have been killed immediately. But we went to Guatemala where, there's been a dictatorship, a military dictatorship for, decades, thanks in part to this country, but that's another story. So there are human rights activists down there who literally are putting their lives on the line. It's not like going to a march for, let's say, Black Lives Matter or whatever it is people march for. They're literally putting their lives on the line by, protesting or, trying to make changes there. And I really had to ask myself, is this something I would be willing to do? I mean, I don't mind dying that much. I mind being tortured. So how much do we put on the line if we really believe in something? Has anybody ever thought about that? About how much you'd be willing to sacrifice in order to make the change that you think is important? I mean, maybe you need to go to Guatemala to think about it, but it's a big question. I mean, whatever your politics, if you're looking at what's going on in this country and you say, okay, things are really bad one way or the other, and we got to do something about it, but what are you willing to do to make that happen? Other than, let's say, vote, because
Speak truth to power. Speak truth to power whenever you can. And I think that's what Vashti did. She spoke truth to power. She said no. How brave is that to say no?
yeah, because according to the rabbi, she got decapitated for that. But you're right, speaking truth to power is absolutely, crucial. But sometimes when you speak truth to power, you get put in prison, right? Look what happened. Look what's happening in Russia right now. How many thousands of people were arrested and put in prison for supporting the opposition leader, right? So these women are very brave, I have to say. Both Vashti saying no, and Esther saying, okay, I'll go to the king. I'll go to the king and we'll see what happens. She's pushed by Mordecai, but she does it. So if you had a little daughter who was going to a Purim party, would you have her dress up as Esther or as Vashti?
Well, Vashti.
Yeah.
But maybe Esther.
Okay.
Maybe both, because I think they were both feminists in their own way. And we can't put them in a box. They were both feminists. I think they were both feminists.
Great.
I want to echo what Arava just said. I think if I had a daughter, I'd be the same way, that they're both strong women in completely different ways. And both of them are worthy of holding up the way the authors of Fiddler on the Roof in the Shabbat blessing said, may you be like Ruth and like Esther.
Mm.
And they're holding up two of the women that have agencies in our sacred tradition.
Good point.
As opposed to be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And so you see that Esther could have lost her life if the stupid, incompetent, drunken king had gone the other way. And she used immense skill to hoist Haman on his own petard.
Yes.
Which took a lot of strategy and thought, and that she was able to do that in such a compelling way. And also Vashti's refusal to show up is also powerful in a different kind of way. So they're both really, to me, feminist exemplars that we can learn different lessons from.
Thank you, David. Very, very well said. Very well said.
Does the fact that Vashti sort of died in vain mean anything here, though, and Esther didn't?
Vashti didn't die. That's Midrash.
Ah.
Well, she didn't die. And by the way, as I said, they publicized what she did. Okay. They put a decree out to the entire kingdom, which covered a lot of land, to say you have to obey your husband and you can't act like Vashti, and therefore giving everybody an idea that they may not have had before. Oh, you mean I can disobey my husband? The queen did it, so why couldn't I? So yeah, she definitely served as an important role model.
I'd suggest that that if you had a daughter, that you should have her understand the story first and then pick the role that she wants to be, either Vashti or Esther, either one.
Very
She should
nice.
make that decision.
That's very nice. That's very nice. You want her to have her own choices as to who she's going to be.
But Vashti just said no. And I grew up with that you have the power to say no. When something's not right for you as a woman, you can say no. And that's what Vashti represents for me, is the power of no.
Great. Great.
It's really important, I mean, to say no.
Well, we certainly see how, the women are treated here, that, they're basically sexual objects, right? And she just says, I'm not going to be treated that way. So I had mentioned something about Mordecai earlier and how things are sort of upside down and reversed. So I just wanted to look at that for a minute. Any thoughts about Mordecai? I mean, I assume you know the story. We didn't go over all the details, but what do you think's going on with him? Do you think he's just an innocent? Yeah, Sandy Eichel. Yeah.
I think that Mordecai is using his niece or cousin to an end, and he's, instead of putting himself on the line, he's putting Esther on the line.
Very good. Very good. Any other thoughts about what Mordecai's up to? As I indicated earlier, the fact that he's not bowing down to Haman is not really based on any religious belief. And you sort of wonder, okay, at the end of all of this, Mordecai takes Haman's place. And you kind of wonder, was this his sort of intention from the beginning? Yeah, go ahead.
I want to disagree with the premise. I just think that Mordecai happened to be out and around and he heard about the plot to kill. And it was, the story is a fuch, like you say, it's upside down. Because one of the things that allowed Mordecai to be honored wasn't that Esther had the plan, but that he was reading about what Mordecai did in the annals of the king that got written down because he couldn't sleep one night.
Right.
So that takes the deviousness kind of away from Mordecai as being sort of aspiring to that role, I think.
Well, it's certainly that the fact that he saved the king's life was just something that he happened to be lucky enough to hit upon. I don't consider that to be sort of part of any plot, but I do have some questions about him, just because he seems to be a little provocative of Haman. And as Sandy said, he uses his niece to get himself into the palace. And I'm not saying that he's guilty. I'm just saying I have questions. And
all I want to just shade that a little bit with is that she came along after the king saw many other women as well.
True.
And she had special privilege in the harem getting ready. That did not come from Mordecai, but came from the head of the harem.
Right.
So those are other little, but I mean, and I'm personally puzzling over because I've never seen Mordecai as being an active player in terms of becoming the king's advisor. It seems to me that given the nature of Achashverosh, he doesn't think about who his advisor is at all.
Right.
So whoever it is, whether it's Haman or Mordecai, makes this an incredibly powerful person. And I won't make any contemporary analogies. I'll just leave it there.
Okay, that's fine.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
I think Mordecai was a pretty clever guy. Remember, the objective was to save the Jews from being killed. So he analyzes the king, understands the king's motivations, and he says, the way to influence the king is to try and get my beautiful niece Esther. That's the way to influence the king. He analyzed the situation. He understood the king's weakness, and he maneuvered to exploit that weakness in order to save the Jews. That was the objective.
Right. Except the only reason he had to save the Jews is because of his behavior. They were threatened in the first place. It's not completely clear. I think there's a little bit of ambiguity in there. I guess my final question is really, why do we have a holiday like this where everything's upside down? You know, a lot of times you do, like you conduct the service backwards. In fact, that's what we're going to do next week, is do the service backwards. You know, start with the mourner's cottage and go to the opening song at the end. Very often when you do a service for Purim, you know, you wear if you wear tefillin or whatever, you wear them kind of askew, and you're supposed to drink enough that you supposedly can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. There's another clue to, what does that mean that you can't tell the difference? That one's so good and one's so bad, that, you know, that they sort of meet somewhere at the extremes, or maybe they aren't so different. I don't know. But what is the purpose of having this kind of a holiday, do you think? Yes, Sandy.
I've heard an interpretation that it's just something stuck into the literature that is fiction, that it takes place in Persia, which is not where the Jews were, and it's just there.
Right. But we could just have that story stuck into the Bible, but why do we have this holiday that we celebrate every year?
To me, it's all about the masks, you know, the hiddenness of God. And I love that. That's what I teach the kids, is that, you know, God's not in this story at all, but God's all over the story.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge is to find where God is, you know, where you find that holiness in the story. And I know it's you know, you read it on so many different levels, but, you know, find God in the story. I think that's the challenge.
That's nice. That's a really nice approach. Any other thoughts? Obviously, I have an idea, but so, you know, Judaism is very much focused on a lot of rules. I mean, in Reform Judaism, obviously, we don't necessarily follow them so much, but traditionally, Judaism is all about rules, right? A lot of people even think of Shabbat as just all the things you're not allowed to do, even though there's obviously a different significance to Shabbat. But there are a lot of things we're supposed to do and not supposed to do and all of that. And one time a year, we get to just let loose, which I think many cultures have, right? Mardi Gras just happened in New Orleans very quietly this year, but I think cultures have a day like that where you just have to say, okay, no rules today. Everything's backwards. Everything's upside down. And maybe that allows you to appreciate the chaos that is there, you know, the chaos that God kind of organized for us when God created the world. It's a way for us to maybe appreciate the rules and appreciate order and structure. I think everybody needs, you know, some time to just kind of go, whatever, you know, all is permitted. You know, I can drink and get so drunk that I can't tell the difference between these two people, and I can wear a costume and a mask. And I think that that's just something that is important as a kind of outlet for people. And again, just as a way to maybe appreciate the chaos and the order. So thank you. I think we're just about out of time, so I will hand it over to Nancy.
I want to thank you, Suzanne, for a fun talk tonight. I think it made a lot of us think things a little bit differently, perhaps. And we always appreciate having you participate with us. And we appreciate your congregants joining with us tonight. So happy Purim, everyone.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I hope you all enjoy Purim and drink a little bit, or wear a mask, or wear something upside down.
Or drink a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thank you very much.